A government that struggles to keep itself open. Russia, knee-deep in our democracy. An all-out war on environmental protection. A Justice Department rolling back civil rights by the day. Hatred and supremacy proudly marching in our streets. Bullets tearing through our classrooms, concerts, and congregations, targeting our safest, sacred places. And this nagging, sinking feeling, no matter your political beliefs, that this is not right. This is not who we are.
How could Trump is involved so deeply in this Russian probe that he's out there firing everybody he gets near. He's scared to death of Rosenstein, scared to death of Mueller. All these guys he wants to get rid of. He's involved in a purge right now, a slow motion Saturday night massacre. And yet he didn't mention it to the American people tonight when he had an audience with them. What do you make of that? Never mentioned it.
Well, no, he didn't mention the Me Too movement either, and
That's
maybe
true.
for similar reasons. Yes, of course, it was an odd feeling watching the speech. You guys may be better political historians than I am, but I don't remember a time when you would watch a State of the Union address being delivered by a president who is, I guess you could say, actively betraying the country. And I don't think those are too strong words. This is a guy who just refused to enact the sanctions that Congress nearly unanimously voted for against Russia. And he said, you know, I'm just not going to do it.
And
He's
also,
done
Mike
everything
Pompeo, his CIA director, our CIA director for the country, comes out today and said they're going to do the same thing in 2018 this year. Mess with our elections.
And they're continuing to do it right now. I mean, they've never stopped. And of course, it's going to roll into 2018 and 2020. And this man, the country has been attacked by Russia in this way, and this is a guy who's doing nothing to defend the country.
Why not?
Why not? Because
come on, you got to help me with this. What do you think? Is it the money he got through the Deutsche Bank, or what is it? Family money?
I think ultimately it will come down to money. I think ultimately it's going to come down to money. You'll follow the money, and that's going to give you the answer. We won't know until we know all the facts. But clearly, there's something there. This man is not behaving normally. You could say, in regards to Russia. He's hiding something.
Well, I believe in economic determinism in many cases. You and I were chatting before we came on. I do think it's reasonable to say follow the money. Why does he have this interest? Why does his family spend a lot of time with Russians? Is that how you finance real estate these days?
Well, I mean, if you look at his history, obviously the Russian financing that both his sons have bragged about in terms of who financed their golf courses during a time when golf courses were losing money, who dug them out of the hole.
How many Russians do you hang out with?
I know exactly none.
It's a particular ethnic national interest this family has.
Because, well, when no one would lend them money, when Deutsche Bank even stopped lending them money, they, by their own, braggadocio, were bailed out by Russians. He has this affinity for Russia. He went there in 2013 to bring his Miss Universe pageant there. But I think you make an important point, Chris, in that the defining issue of the Trump administration thus far is how he got into office. It consumes Donald Trump's time. It is an obsession, if you believe all of the reporting in the Michael Wolff book, and even not beyond the Michael Wolff book. He spends his time complaining about the prosecutors who are investigating Russian interference, conspiring to fire them, thinking about them, obsessing about them, and then he gives a speech tonight in which he makes it sound like the biggest issue in the United States, the biggest threat is MS-13, a gang nobody that doesn't watch Fox News has ever heard of. So he makes it sound like they're the biggest threat.
Why does he do it?
Because he's playing to the audience that he wants applause from. And the audience on the right just wants to hear that. First half of that speech, by the way, sounded like he went in a time machine and gave it in 1950. He talked about bringing coal back, a dying industry. Beautiful coal.
What is that about?
He sounded like he was running for president against Dwight Eisenhower. I don't know. He sounded like a president from the past. And then the second half of the speech was about how all immigrants are murderers and he needs to stop them from coming to the country through family migration. It was a bizarre two-part speech.
I think, Ron, it was a combination of going for that between 39%, which he has now, trying to climb back to high 40s, trying to get that sort of increment back of people who are sort of center right, who went with him, maybe angry Democrats, resentful Democrats, trying to win them back. But he was cloaking his darker purposes. He was always a lot of candy coating of the speech tonight. Even all those families, they were all very empathetic or sympathetic families, but the message was, we hate the goddamn North Koreans, and we hate the drug dealers, and we hate that people that they come from, right? That was it all about.
Right. Immigrants are all MS-13 members, and I'm sure all of, everybody is going home tonight terrified that MS-13 is going to attack them on the way home. As Joy said, really, who runs into these people? I'm not saying that they don't exist.
Right.
But come on, it's not exactly a national scourge here. But so something else that Joy was talking about, and there is this sort of odd feeling you get when you listen to Donald Trump making a speech like this. And I think part of it is that he doesn't actually inhabit the words that he's saying. He has never thought those words. Somebody has written them down,
that is
put them on a prompter,
you think he just saw them on the prompter?
They were revealed to him on the prompter.
He met them.
Chris,
on the
how
prompter.
much time do you think Donald Trump spends thinking about black unemployment, right? And he goes on, he reads it with this sort of, wow, gee whiz, I just read that for the first time. I mean, yeah, he seems to be discovering every word he's saying for the very first time until he gets to the Stephen Miller part of the speech. You can actually tell when the speech writing pivots to Stephen Miller, and then we're back to this dark
let's look at it now.
American carnage.
As Joy said, President
too.
Trump did make this mention of the federal bureaucracy, a possible reference to his ongoing war with the FBI over the Russia investigation. Watch this weird little thing here.
So tonight I call on Congress to empower every cabinet secretary with the authority to reward good workers and to remove federal employees who undermine the public trust or fail the American people.
There you go, the old argument, mob at the gate, coming across the border, and the rot at the top. This is classic demagoguery. We got people here who are rotten, and we're going to get them. Your thoughts,
That's right.
Ron?
Yes, people who are against me because I am the state. I am the American people in a sense. And if they're against any of those things, if they're against me, they're against that. And so we must get rid of those people. McCabe leaving the FBI now. There's a perfect example.
Rod Rosenstein, he's the next one on the list.
He's next up, yes.
Yeah, I mean, here's a guy who, arrived separately from his wife, who is not exactly a loyal husband, sort of saying, I am the embodiment of faith, family, and 1950s values for like half a speech, and then turning and saying, we're gonna, clean out the deep state, run all the people who are not loyal to me out of Washington. Donald Trump wants loyalty, but he wants loyalty of the kind that you typically have in a banana republic, where everyone's too afraid to oppose the leader.
You always over.
Or doesn't dare.
You always outdoing it. It's great having you on. Joy Reid, as always, Ron Reagan, thank you for coming on tonight.
Put aside your partisanship. Not only has the United States been attacked, but it is being attacked. We are under attack right now by the continued cyber efforts of the Russians to undermine our institutions and undermine our electoral process. And this isn't a question. We know factually that this is happening in the United States of America. There is a consensus upon our intelligence community about what's happening. And so to have the President of the United States not sound the alarm, which Republicans have said. Orrin Hatch called this akin to a Pearl Harbor-like attack. For the President of the United States not to recognize that and not to take every effort and every measure to do something about it is unacceptable. When Putin is not met by power, it is almost like he is giving an invitation to continue his assaults. And we have not matched his assaults with our own pushing back. And the way to do that is the tools we've given the president, which he has claimed that are not necessary, he has not used. That's tantamount to a malfeasance and opening ourselves up to having even worse problems in 2018 and 2020. And the foreign policy part of this speech, it wasn't just the grand omissions of the reality with what the Russians are doing to the United States of America and our institutions, the grand omission of the cloud hanging over his presidency stemming from Russians' involvement in our administration. But there were so many other omissions. The way he talked about North Korea was a pandering to fear and not a plan. What are we going to do? What's the president's plan besides his castigation of previous presidencies? He omitted what's going on right now in Afghanistan, where you've seen some of the bloodiest days, not one attack, but this drumbeat of dozens and dozens of people dying in Afghanistan right now, and no talk whatsoever about our strategy and plan in Afghanistan. He omitted crises on the planet Earth like we've never seen before, from the refugee crisis in the Congo to the humanitarian crisis in South Sudan. There was no foreign policy in this speech besides appealing to, again, the tired tropes and the red meat, talking about Guantanamo when there's just a handful of people there and it's not a strategic importance when it comes to solving the larger mission of dealing with credible threats to the United States of America.
This president comes in, the most unpopular president this early in his tenure in the history of polling, somebody who has spent the last year leading a faction in this country, dividing the country, somebody who is besieged by criminal investigation, talking about the importance of our law enforcement organizations and institutions, while at the same time the Republican majority working with the White House is engaged in a full-on assault trying to discredit the FBI, the Justice Department, doing everything they conceivably can to insulate the president from these investigations. We heard talk about expanding our nuclear weapons arsenal. There is not one serious student of American defense policy that thinks that this should be the chief goal of strengthening America's military. Across the depth and breadth of this, you saw a divisive speech, the wedge issue of immigration, the scare tactics of MS-13. There was no talk in the speech about the challenges the country faces over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Where are we going as a country? So this divisive president came in tonight at probably the most divided this country has been in the last 50 years since that year of 1968. He did nothing to appeal to the better angels of our nature as a country in this speech, and more than anything, it was a speech delivered almost from an alternate reality, a fifth dimension, that presumes that nothing we heard from this president over the last year, nothing that we've seen actually in fact happened. And of course it did. And the American people know it. And so I think that this is a speech that will not be long remembered. His words will float up like smoke from a fire and dissipate. In 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours from now, we'll see the typical recklessness, the looseness, the tweet out of left field that will extinguish this moment of supposed normalcy from our minds, I suspect, pretty quickly.
Steve Schmidt, I wanted to ask you about some of the first half of the speech, which was almost entirely about the economy and jobs. The president talked up the number of jobs that have been created during his 14 months in office. And it's true, more than 2 million jobs have been created. It's the slowest pace of job growth in the last 7 years. He talked about economic growth as if it is turbocharged, as if we were having a great new period of renewal in terms of economic growth. Economic growth this past year was 2.3%, which is a little bit lower than what most economists expected it to be. It's certainly lower than the 3, 4, even more that he promised as a candidate and even as president. Is there a risk for the Republicans broadly, not just the president, trying to sell the country on an economic miracle when we're kind of just plodding along economically the same way we have been for the past few years and nothing much has changed?
Look, it's all hype, just like it would be out of the condo brochure from the Trump organization trying to sell a couple of units. The reality is that 44% of the United States population does not have $400 cash available to deal with an emergency. 67% of the country doesn't have $1,000 in saving. So the Dow Jones average can be 47,000, and it just doesn't touch huge portions of the country. We still haven't seen any evidence that wages are rising in the middle class, in the middle income workers of the country. And that has been the fundamental problem economically that the country's been dealing with for a generation, is the lack of real wage growth for working people. And that lack of real wage growth in the middle of the economy is fueling a tremendous amount of political instability in our system at this point, as we see a system where all the gains are accruing towards the top.
Every time I listen to Steve Schmidt talk, I make a mental note, learn more words.
Steve literally has all the best words.
He has all the best words.
Some people say they do.
Steve Schmidt, thank you. Thank you for your poetry on the move. Yes, you can ask a political question.
In our old job, you and I would have been watching the Democratic response to understand the competition, if we were in the White House or if we were still in Republican politics. I counted in Joe Kennedy's response 15 we's, 7 you's, and 0 I's. And you and me and our old colleague Matthew Dowd and the old chairman of the Bush campaign, Ken Mellman, would have seen a politician who speaks in the language of we, you, and no I's as a real formidable voice. What did you make of the Democratic response?
It's the most effective response we've seen from a member of any party for quite a long time. He's a rising star in the Democratic Party. He's going to have a big future. And I think about the congressman in close adjacency to him there in Massachusetts, the combat Marine Corps veteran Seth Moulton, and Congressman Kennedy, Congressman Moulton, a couple of others, I think represent a real changing of the guard inside the Democratic Party, and we'll be seeing a lot more of these younger members who are in their late 30s, early 40s over this next 2-year period.
Told them if you are vetted, which they all were, and you cleared the vet, which they were, which is why they were recipients of DACA, we told them that we will not deport them. Let's keep our promise to them.
Senator, were you shocked that the president introduced a discussion in a country of immigrants on immigration on MS-13? That's how he began the conversation today. Your thoughts?
You're absolutely correct, and you know we've talked about this before. I'm a career prosecutor. I have personally prosecuted everything from low-level offenses to homicides. As the Attorney General of California, one of my main areas of focus was going after transnational criminal organizations who are engaged in trafficking guns, drugs, and human beings. MS-13 is an example of some of the worst of criminal gang behavior. To equate that with Dreamers and DACA was completely irresponsible, and it was scapegoating, and it was fear-mongering, and it was wrong.
I heard a non-starter. Let's just take this one element. And I think sometimes if there is an argument that is made, a basis for an argument that is just a bald-faced lie, he said that immigrants can come to this country and then apply for an unlimited number of distant relatives to come to the country. Well, guess what? It would be a surprise to me that my wife is a distant relative. She's a very close and intimate, that my children are distant relatives, that my sister and that my mom and dad. Those are the categories of people. It's called family reunification, and it's worked in America. It's what makes us the kind of nation that we are today. And so he goes and says he's out to get the illegal immigrants and then attacks the foundation of legal immigration. That's why this is not about a wall. Because if it would have been about a wall, then I think Chuck Schumer would have reached an agreement. I think that Lindsey Graham and Dick Durbin would have reached an agreement, because wall and border security under the Trump administration have become interchangeable. And I say that because when I met with the Chief of Staff Kelly, he says that the president was uninformed when he made the promise. This is what Kelly said to us. He said, we're not going to build a cement 50-foot high wall from sea to shiny she. It's going to be fences. It's going to be the inhospitable terrain. It's going to be drones. Look, if you want to release the hostage that you've taken, the 800,000 dreamers, and what we have to pay is ransom, it's ready, but that's not really what this is about. Here's what they really want to do. And I hope we could take a moment. What they want to do is to give more border enforcement agents so that not they can go after drug dealers, because if they were going after drug dealers, why are they also going after moms and dads that are dropping their children off at school, or going to the hospital, or going to church, or going to work? Why did Congresswoman Dingell bring an American citizen who lost her husband, 30-year-old marriage, to a deportation over nothing? Because they're going after people who really are not criminals. That's what they want to accent deportations to the United States. Here's what they want us to do. They want to say, you want to make a deal with me, Donald Trump? I'll give you 1.8 million visas to keep the Dreamers here. But here's what you've got to give me. You've got to give me the ability to deport their moms and dads. You got to give me the ability to deport their cousins and their siblings that aren't protected. You got to give me more deportation powers. And that's just a deal breaker.
I think he definitely has to figure out how to pacify the Breitbarts of the world, basically saying that he is amnestied on. So I think that he was trying to do that. I think he did it ungracefully. When you're trying to equivocate MS-13 with Dreamers, that's just poor and irresponsible. I also think that the other pieces that he was talking about is not good for the country. And what I mean by that is that, yes, he asked for $23 million, $25 billion, for the wall. Members of Congress will perhaps give him that because, again, they control the person. They recognize that they basically have to reauthorize it year after year. So he's not going to get the chunk of money. So that's fine. I think the bigger concern, both among Republicans and Democrats, is this idea of family reunification. The president himself is a beneficiary of family unification. He wants to get rid of that. The visa lottery system also he wants to get rid of. What the American people need to understand is that this proposal that the White House came up with basically slashes our current immigration levels in half and brings us back closer to levels of the 1920s. What we need is a smart policy. We need to actually recognize what is it the future immigration flows, what is the mixed skill labors that this country needs, and not willy-nilly trying to pit DACA recipients who are here legally because they came out of the shadows, have DACA recipients basically pit themselves against the rest of the immigrants, in some cases their own parents.
I felt the line here that's going to get poured over, one of the lines that's going to get poured over most in this speech is when Trump, on this subject, he said, Americans are dreamers too. And I imagine that's going to be subject to a lot of various interpretation. What's your interpretation of that line, Maria?
That it's divisive as well. This idea that of course Americans are dreamers, but we're also rooted in our immigrant experience. The reason the majority of us are here, with the exception of our Native Americans and African Americans who descended from slaves, the majority of Americans came here with this idea that they can become their possibility in this country. That is not any different 240 years later. So this idea that he is trying to pit this idea of what dreamers are, that is our DNA. What we're talking about is a new generation of dreamers, the ones that came here without, through their family, unfortunately without the proper documentation. At the same time, they're making great strides to achieve. These dreamers specifically have passed background checks. They are contributing to their local economy. And what they want to make a case is, how do they actually participate in this America? And I have to say that I think Joe Kennedy did a fantastic job today delivering his speech. I would say, though, that where he kind of went off guard was when he started speaking to these dreamers in Spanish. Most of them don't speak Spanish. Most of them, that is the issue. This is the only country they know.
This is somebody whose line was, I'm going to throw 12 million people out of here. That was what he said for
I appreciate it, but I appreciate it because the reason he's saying that, though, is because to the majority of Americans who are not deep-seated into this policy issue, it sounds incredibly reasonable. But you start scratching the surface and you recognize how draconian he's actually presenting. He's trying to be magnanimous. He's trying to be the leader that most Americans want him to be. But in fact, what he's doing is actually pushing us backwards instead of coming up with an immigration policy that, again, looks at future immigration flows.
Yeah. Well, Steve, you heard a strong reaction from Democrats tonight because there's a number of things that President Trump just got wrong. When he was talking about family unification, this has been a very important thing to all of us in America who are citizens. If we have sisters or brothers abroad, we want to be able to bring them to the United States to share in this great nation that we're part of. This is woven into the fabric of our nation, and President Trump wants to wipe it out, which is not something that's consistent with who and what we are as a nation, primarily of immigrants. And what he also got wrong is when he said that this is an offer he's making that cuts it down the middle. And I think you heard a lot of reaction to that because it's just such an absurd statement to make. Not only did he not acknowledge the dreamers who were there and the important contributions they're making in their community, and the fact that he's the one that is threatening to make their status illegal. They are illegal now, and he is the one who's taking that away. And then he's saying, well, I'll restore it if you do all these other things that my right-wing base really wants to happen, like wipe out family unification. And so I think it was just not a serious proposal, and everyone knew it in the room, and that was why you got the reaction you did.
Let me ask you a bigger picture, though. For a guy who campaigned for the presidency, the first press conference, or the first speech he gave as a candidate for president, we all remember he talked about Mexicans as rapists coming across the border, somebody who talked about rounding up and throwing out more than 10 million folks who are here right now. When you consider that candidate, and you consider the fact that as president tonight, he did say, among other things, he did say he favors a legalization for 1.8 million. Do you think that's significant at all?
Well, it wasn't new news that he says something good in that regard. He said before he had a big heart, a loving heart towards dreamers, and wanted to address this. But that president you're talking about, or that candidate you're talking about, who had this very ugly, divisive strategy, we saw that again tonight. He repeatedly made the image of immigrants one of gang members, not ones of productive folks who have grown up in our community. They've been in our grade schools with our children, in our high schools, in our colleges, in our workplaces. They are participants, full members of our community. And then he equates them to gang members who come and shoot and do terrible things. And so we saw that ugly side of President Trump once again.
Very quickly, look, the clock is ticking on this, Senator. You know as well as I do, the government funding running out in a few weeks. There was that framework some Democrats were saying was going to lead to a resolution of this issue by then. How confident are you now, a week after the deal to reopen the government, that this issue will be resolved in the coming weeks?
I'm not at all confident. The president is reopening old wounds. He's playing to his Breitbart base. There is a deal on the table right now. There is tremendous bipartisan support for border security, tremendous bipartisan support for addressing the status for the Dreamers. And that deal is just sitting there waiting for the president to actually say yes. But instead, he's resorting to really returning to that candidate Trump who wants to take deals apart rather than put deals together.
Well, what they pitched to us at lunch today, Brian, was we were going to hear a lot of bipartisan, a lot of conciliatory, that it was a unifying message he wanted to send. If that was an attempt at unity, he's got a lot of work to do. Because while I think the beginning of the speech did a good job of at least saying those words, when you look at how he led with immigration, he led in a very divisive way on immigration. Then there's Gitmo. Gitmo got a standing ovation. It was sort of an uncomfortable moment. If you want to keep Gitmo open, it should feel like a necessary evil, not something you stand and applaud. It's it's not a happy day to keep Gitmo open. It should feel like unfortunately we have. I sort of like that one really sort of startled me. What are we cheering about Gitmo? It wasn't the speech that they sold it to be, and honestly, I just don't, I go through these things, especially these teleprompter speeches he gives, it's not him. So it is hard to judge these speeches because we know it's not him. It's him reading off a teleprompter. There are some things he says that sound like him, totally, and he'll throw in a beautiful and an extra totally, but you can tell he's reading it. He doesn't own it. They're better off, I think they would be better off letting him ad-lib it. Because it would at least be authentic. There's a missing authenticity thing. You guys are laughing. I'm being semi-serious here, not semi.
All right, Andrea Mitchell.
Follow the president on Twitter, Chuck? He'd get himself indicted if he ripped. The White House is right now in a duel with Mueller's investigators over whether or not he could be interviewed.
No. I take your point. I'm just saying the Donald Trump we know as a country that we interact with every day, with his Twitter feed, with the asides and all of this, the guy that, likes to give us all nicknames, that isn't who you saw, right? And you don't see this Trump very often, so I don't know if it can sell anything. That's my point here.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much ability this version of President Trump does to persuade anybody, because you don't see it very often.
Chuck, you just allowed how this worked. The first half of the speech, about 11 pages of it, exactly half the speech, was this sort of confection, like devil's food cake with vanilla icing. It was just great to eat, and it's all nice. And then and let's have some ribeye steak now. It was a weird way of putting together a meal. The whole first part of the speech was aimed at, I said, dancing the stars, regular people, not political people at all. Get back, and Nicole said, bring back that 10% you've lost the last year. But then he goes this hard-charging MS-13. It gets ugly. And then bringing on the sad cases of the victims, one after another. I mean, really, using those experiences, let's put it that way, of the American life, and doing it in a way that's, my God, this is really heavy stuff. I've never seen a speech put together like this before. The dessert first, and then the really raw meat. What's it about?
I thought the only explanation I had about the immigration decision is he knows he's making his base have to accept citizenship for these dreamers. So perhaps he feels the need to not talk about it, right? He waited to the end of his immigration remarks. Let me tell you about MS-13, and let me tell you about every criminal alien that I can think of, and let me tell you all these stories. It may be a way he thinks he has to sell his immigration compromise to his base. Perhaps I'm being charitable, but that would be the most rational political explanation for doing immigration the way he did it in this speech.
Well, the fact that Russia is overhanging everything and that he will not acknowledge what his own CIA briefer, Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, whom he's so close to, spends hours every day with, has said this week that Russia is still going after us, still planning to interfere with our 2018 midterm elections, that we have not stopped the Russian threat. Yet we see today the State Department and Treasury dragging their feet on the overwhelmingly approved Russian sanctions from this Congress, bipartisan, overwhelming, hundreds of votes, more than 500 votes in favor of that. And at the same time, he doesn't even mention that Russian threat in any real sense, and won't acknowledge the investigation that he's facing, and understandably that. But the fact that he will not even agree with what his own CIA is saying about Russia is another indication he cannot deal with the reality of what Russia did with this election. He seems to feel that that is a threat to his own legitimacy, even though it does not necessarily mean that at all. He's the president of the United States. He was there at the podium today. I thought that by encouraging the applause, this is stylistic, by applauding himself and stopping at the end of every sentence, and by the Republicans jumping up, he slowed it down too much and made it seem even less Trumpian than otherwise. Chuck talks about maybe he should have outlived it, and we know how effective he's been at rallies, and I don't think it's that he should have outlived it, but I think he should have picked up the pace. These stories were very affecting. I mean, you can't help but be heartbroken, and at the loss of those families and at the adoption of that infant and all of the rest. So that's very well done to illustrate his policies. Guantanamo, I don't understand that either. There are 41 detainees now at Guantanamo. At its height over the years, there have been 708. But why take that on? It's another base-pleasing moment. And the fact checkers are going to be up all night, because on clean coal, here we have a president in 2018 advertising the coal industry and not talking about the future. I mean, how that is appealing to anybody. And also false claims on the auto industry, false claims on job creation, exaggerating that, go one thing after another. And of course, the grandiose claims about the tax bill. The individual tax cuts are going to expire. The corporate ones stay forever.